So thank you for joining us today. Without any further ado, Dr. Ryan Petgill.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing us to present some of our original research. We are honored to be here this afternoon. This talk is entitled Maurice Sugar, Tony Paris, and Other Sounds of the Labor Movement. But before we get into the heart of that matter, there's another crucial element to our argument that I need to go over with you. So in 1978, there was a historian by the name of Lawrence Goodwin who coined this term movement culture. Now, what he meant by that was the culture, mass culture, that accompanied social movements such as the Populist movement of the 1890s. The songs, poems, dramas, or short stories that were written by people that associated with the Populists could be used to convey important messages and information to those people that were gathered in places like Lampasas, Texas in the 1890s. But more importantly, they were way superior to the politicians that would get up on the political stump and give these hours-long speeches, in the sense that you knew the heart of the matter and you knew it very quickly. Quick example. A song like The Farmer is the Man could tell folks in Lampasas who the farmer was, what his struggle involved, who the bad guys were, and what needed to be done in a matter of minutes. I'd like to give you a quick sample of how effective the fusion of music and messaging is. And I want to do so with our honored guests that were good enough to be here today. In 1936, a singer, songwriter, and history teacher by the name of Jimmy Driftwood wrote a tune entitled The Battle of New Orleans. And this song was to help his high school students better understand the history of the War of 1812. And so for right now, what I want to do is turn this over to my much more talented colleagues, Tony Paris, and of course our own Jonathan York.
Okay. Forgive me if I mess this up. In 1814 we took a little trip. Let's try again, I screwed it up already. In 1814 we took a little trip, along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we caught the bloody British in the town of New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British get to come. And it wasn't as many as there was a while ago. We fired our score and they began a run on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
Thank you, guys. Hey,
I wasn't prepared to sing.
No, they deserve a lot of credit in the sense that a lot of this is being done on the fly. But I'll tell you what, do you want me to yap at you for a good solid hour and a half, or do you want to hear Jonathan play the rest of that, right? You see what I mean? This is really a nice way to understand some pretty heavy things in a very enjoyable sort of format, okay? Before I go any further, I want to introduce our last guest here. That would be Tony Paris, who is from the Sugar Law Center in Detroit, Michigan. He can talk a little bit about that toward the end of this presentation here today. But to give you a little bit of the backstory, my project, as in this project, began several months ago. I began putting it together, and a lot of colleagues pointed me in the direction of the Sugar Law Center. And so I made a phone call over there one afternoon, and the guy on the other end of the line was the guy that you're looking at right here, and he gave me a lot of the background story when it comes to who Maurice Sugar was and how he came to sort of encompass labor history, okay? Tony is the lead attorney at the Sugar Law Center. He earned a degree in law from Wayne State University in 2007. And he has worked at the Sugar Law Center, which dedicates itself to what might be thought of as economic and financial justice in Detroit and the surrounding area. Again, I'll turn things over to him a little bit later so he can tell you a little bit more specifically about what the Sugar Center does. But for the time being, historians have long been aware of various unconventional methods when it comes to their use of social activism. But one element of mass culture that I feel is really overlooked by historians and other scholars alike is music, for reasons that we just got done hearing. And so this is especially the case when it comes to the labor movement. Now, to be very clear here, what I'm talking about is the movement to empower working people, the movement to form unions to bargain collectively with employers, and probably most importantly of all, the movement to instill elements of dignity into all types of human labor. So the great union drives of the 30s and 40s, they featured artists like Woody Guthrie, Alan Lomax, Pete Seeger, and I don't know about you, but I remember singing a lot of their songs on carpets in grade school, not really knowing, exactly what we were singing or the context in which those songs were being performed. But one of the things that I feel is really overlooked by all of this would be the socially conscious lyrics that define the struggle for civil and human rights throughout the 20th century. To that end, one of the more important singer-songwriters of that era was a lawyer from Detroit by the name of Maurice Sugar. March 10th, 2018, labor unionists, community activists, and individuals committed to the pursuit of social justice gathered at the Sugar Law Center in Detroit for the annual Buck Dinner. This is important in and of itself. The Buck Dinner traces its roots back a long, long time ago, 1929, September 1929, when our friend Maurice Sugar shot a deer in the woodlands of Michigan, and he harvested it, invited about 12 of his closest friends to his home, and it was the middle of winter in Michigan, so you can imagine how cold that is, and to keep themselves warm, what they did is they feasted on venison and they sang songs. And the camaraderie, the good spirits were so good that they felt that this should become an annual sort of gathering, and it should happen every year, and it grew every year. Tony can talk about that in a little bit. But in any case, this annual event became known as the Buck Dinner. Now, as important as that was, the who's who of social and political activists in Detroit and the surrounding regions, I think one of the more important elements is the music that is going to accompany this. In 1932, Maurice Sugar wrote a song entitled The Soup Song, and it was sung widely, but at work stoppages, picket lines, and mass demonstrations throughout the Great Depression. And I feel that it was Sugar's fusion of labor activism with mass culture that's going to provide a lasting legacy for organized labor into the future. Sugar was a labor lawyer. At one point, he was a card-carrying member of the Socialist Party, and later on openly associated with members of the Communist Party. Throughout his legal career, he defended a whole smorgasbord of individuals who, without his help, would have been without legal recourse. From the mid-1930s to the end of World War II, he was responsible for things that you and I take for granted. Handing somebody a leaflet, for example. The idea of being able to participate in a boycott. Those were not always things that were squeaky clean legal, and Maurice Sugar is responsible for, in a large part anyway, for making those things legal. But generally speaking, we're talking about grassroots activism. He was also central in the development of a labor culture, as you're going to find out. Now, when I began this research, the things that came up again and again and again would be his legal career, and I'll touch on some of those things here in a moment. Some of the other things that Sugar was responsible for was the creation of a constitution for the United Auto Workers Union, one of the biggest and most powerful unions in the history of American labor. Sugar wrote editorials for labor journals. He was featured on radio broadcasts, and most importantly, he wrote music that became a soundtrack for the labor movement. What I'm going to argue for you here today was that Sugar's contribution to the movement culture became important representations of inspiration, resolve, and probably most important of all, messaging within the movement. A historian named Michael Denning has posited that by the early 1930s, the American left was at the center of a movement culture that stressed democracy, inclusion, and anti-fascism. By the late 1930s, Denning asserts that the labor union intellectual, his terminology, not mine, had come to play an instrumental role in the world of working class activism. But in Detroit, no person fit that description better than Maurice Sugar. Sugar was a part of this movement culture in the labor movement, and he wrote numerous songs, a few of which had become embedded in the soundtrack of the movement of the 1930s. Most importantly of all, and Dr. Sanchez will pick this up and talk about this a little bit later today, in time, his work is going to be picked up and emulated, not just in Detroit, but elsewhere as well. Sugar was born to Jewish immigrant parents in 1891 in the small town of Brimley, Michigan. He attended law school at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And in 1913, after graduation, he joined the Michigan Bar Association as well as the Socialist Party. Why do I tell you that? Because Sugar was deeply immersed in the world of left-wing politics within that time period. Now, in the middle of all of this, we're going to have the Great Depression. We're going to have the crashing of the stock market, and capitalism as it was known is going to be in shambles. I don't know that there's a great way to adequately describe the Great Depression. A guy from Stanford does it pretty well. If you can envision AT&T Stadium letting out every Sunday. And on the way out, every single one of those workers are handed a pink slip and say, you no longer have a job, you no longer have a job. Now imagine that happening week after week after week for 52 weeks. And that's some of the taste of what the Great Depression was. Now, I want to turn our attention for just a second. You've got to understand that in the 1920s, the roaring 20s, not just culturally, but economically as well, there was no better representation of successful capitalism than Henry Ford, right? Unfettered, unapologetic, and most importantly, unregulated capitalism. Ford posited that what was good for Henry Ford was good for the United States. Henry Ford knew how to run business. Uncle Sam didn't. So Uncle Sam letting Henry Ford run his business the way that Ford knew how was good for everyone. Well, the Great Depression kind of dispelled that myth. In 1932, there was a hodgepodge of radicals. Now, when I say hodgepodge, I mean socialists, communists, just a bunch of people that wanted to call all of this into question. And they organized what came to be known as the Ford Hunger March. When I look out there, I see several colleagues, historians. Dr. Elfers is here, Professor Means, and of course, Dr. Sanchez. We all talk in our History 1302 classes, we all talk about the Ford Hunger March and what this all meant. One of the things that I don't think gets enough press, enough play, is the violence that is going to erupt. The Ford Hunger Marchers were marching to not City Hall, certainly not even the state capital of Michigan, but to Dearborn, Michigan, to present a list of demands to Henry Ford to provide some relief, right? Henry Ford said, trust me, follow me, and we will all be better off, and clearly we're not. Things began to unravel when they approached the corporate gates of the Ford Motor Company. You got to understand that anytime you're talking about genius, there's also a little bit of crazy that comes along with that. And believe me when I say Ford was a little bit of crazy, and I'm probably being pretty polite. Weeks before the march, Henry Ford had installed machine guns, not making it up, machine guns to the top of his factory. Now, in the midst of the Ford Hunger March, what's going to happen is the police force, including Henry Ford's own private police force, is going to disperse the crowd, or at least going to disrupt them. They're never really going to be able to make their demands. But in the midst of all of this chaos and confusion, you're going to see gunfire break out, right? I'll talk a little bit more about that for this in a minute, but for right now, there's going to be 5 people that die from this Ford Hunger March. The district attorney at the time was a guy by the name of Harry S. Toy that just became convinced that this was the evil work of communists, that this is exactly what they wanted. What they wanted was chaos, confusion, disorder. They wanted a disruption very similar to a guy from Moscow by the name of Vladimir Lenin. So what they could do, similar to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, is use this emergency to turn the government over to communism. Harry Toy is going to make approximately 44 arrests, and it's going to be our good friend, Maurice Sugar, that will defend these guys in court. Now, let's be really clear about something, right? We're talking about people that were marching for jobs. That's what they wanted from Ford. They wanted jobs. They wanted bread for relief. They wanted some relief from the Great Depression. My point in telling you that, we're not talking about people that have lawyers on retainer. We're not people that can, talking about writing a check that can afford to buy the best and brightest legal minds. Maurice Sugar defended these people pro bono for free. Now, not only does he manage to acquit, or at least get them off the hook, each and every one of these individuals, but he reveals some pretty unsettling trends in terms of American democracy. Number one, At the time of the arrest, not one of these individuals had an arm on them, not a gun, not nothing, right? Number two, most of these individuals had joined the march, not on any kind of premeditated sort of circumstances, but they had joined out of curiosity. What's going on? This looks kind of interesting. I'll see what it is. But probably most importantly of all, when those medical reports came back, they indicated that those individuals had been shot in their sides as well as in their backs. Now, I don't know if there's any aspiring criminal justice majors out there, but if you study forensic science, what does that tell you? If you're shot in your back, in your side, what was the crowd in the middle of doing when Ford opened up fire on them? What were they doing? They were probably running away. A lot of good evidence suggests exactly that. So what this says is Ford fired not only on an unarmed crowd, but in a crowd that was in full retreat. There's no event that destroys the credibility and the reputation of Henry Ford as the successful means of capitalism more devastatingly than the Ford Hunger March, right? And of course, Maurice Sugar plays a very central role in all of that. So this is really the context in which most historians understand Maurice Sugar. But again, the important contribution that we hope to make here a little bit later today is the movement culture that he was also very directly involved with. I'm going to plagiarize something, even though I don't think that you should plagiarize. Plagiarism is bad, right? Jonathan will tell you that. I'm going to plagiarize Tony. Tony used this terminology in Detroit when we gave this talk earlier last year. I described Maurice Sugar as a self-hating lawyer, and as somebody that has studied Sugar pretty long and diligently, I agree with that. He was a very capable lawyer, as I hope I'm able to convey to you, but I think really what his passion was the movement, and in particular the cultural element of the movement. Sugar's going to write songs throughout the Depression years that will encapsulate the class struggle, the despair, the ambitions, and in some case, the literal hunger of working class Americans. The reason that I feel that his work resonated so much with the American people was it was grounded in fact, it was grounded in real life events, including the Hunger March. One of my favorite songs is a song succinctly entitled The Soup Song. It was very commonly sung along work stoppages, picket lines, and other forms of demonstrations throughout the Great Depression. But what I find fascinating about this is the context in which it was written. It was written in the middle of the night, 2 o'clock in the morning, after Sugar had just gotten back from a speaking engagement at a lodge in Detroit for homeless men. Now, if you know anything about the Great Depression, two things that really come to mind very quickly, photographs like Dorothy Lang, right? Bread lines and soup kitchens. He was there speaking to a group of people that were basically homeless, victims, if you will, of the Great Depression. If you're familiar with Rudy Valley's Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, this is very similar in the sense that it captures the resentment of the common man, that common man that had laid the Transcontinental Railroad, that had built an industrial infrastructure to make us the mightiest economy in the world, and had just gotten done fighting a world war. And now that man finds himself in a bread line just waiting for a handout. I'm not doing this justice. Tony and Jonathan can do a much better job, so I'm going to turn this over to these guys.
Okay, everybody. I'm Tony Paris. Thanks for having me. Maurice Sugar, he wrote the song in the middle of the night, and he wrote a lot of different ideas down that he wanted to convey to people that are simpler and more truthful and quicker than the law. So when I say self-hating lawyer, what I mean is he knew the law had its problems. He had to wait months. He had to wait a very long time and have to go to school forever, and it was made and enforced by white men in power, and he couldn't always get the results, just like I can't always get the results that we might want to see in court. So he started writing down almost like bumper stickers and poetry and things that he wanted workers that are from different countries that came to Detroit, workers that came from the South and the Great Migration, African American workers, all of these workers to be able to have a bite-sized truth of a huge idea that he was writing legal and scholarly papers about. So this song is called The Soup Song, and at the Buck Dinner they still sing it every year. And each verse of it, I think, if you take it in the context of today, it still applies in more ways than you might think, okay? So it says, it goes like this. I'm spending my nights at the farmhouse. I'm spending my days on the street. I'm looking for work, I can't find none. I wish I had something to eat. Soup, they gave me a bowl of soup. They gave me a bowl of soup. I spent 20 years in a factory. I did everything I was told. They said I was loyal and faithful. So why now before I get old? Just they gave me a bowl of soup. They gave me a bowl of soup. I saved 15 bucks with my banker. Buy me a car and a home. I went down to draw out my money. The bank said your home's been foreclosed. What? Soup. They gave me a bowl of soup. They gave me a bowl of soup. This is my favorite verse, especially when you think about Maurice Sugar had been actually disbarred as a lawyer, kicked out, because he had refused to go fight in World War I. And we had another war that was brewing, World War II, with some people would say Henry Ford's buddies over in Germany. And he was very concerned that just because he chose not to fight, just because he protested the war, they put him in jail for a year and took away his license to practice law. Even though he got famous, became a great attorney, he was never able to practice in federal court because of that. So this verse goes like this. I went out to fight for my country. Went out to bleed and to die. I thought that my country might help me, but this was my country's reply. They gave me a bowl of soup. 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 They gave me a bowl of soup. Soup. They gave me a bowl of soup. 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 They gave me a bowl of soup.
I feel like you guys should just teach 1302 for us. It's just like, what am I supposed to say? So, my job is to give you some of the historical context in all of this, and the soup song was very popular with workers for really obvious reasons. According to Sugar, the Flint sit-down strike, which we'll talk about here in just a moment, sang it, these strikers that were locked on the inside of the factory sang it at mealtime while on strike inside the factory. Now, if you know anything about a sit-down strike, it's exactly what it sounds like it is. In labor history, every time Homestead, in Pullman Town in Chicago, throughout the Gilded Age, every time the workers left the factory and said, we're not going back to work until you give us what we demand, they would break the strike with replacement workers. And so in 1937, the workers got this great idea to not leave the factory, lock themselves in, and we're not coming out until you recognize the union, which is exactly what the federal government says we've got the right to have, right? And what Sugar said, that these workers were singing not only this song, but other songs inside the factory, and it's going to keep the spirits high. Years later, he's going to claim that he had been granted a pass by the strikers and give it a guided tour, and he witnessed, quote, long lines of workers standing with soup bowls in their hands, waiting to have them filled from the gigantic soup cistern, and all the time they were singing the soup song with gusto, end quote. The Detroit Times, which is the business community's paper in Detroit, or was, characterized the Soup song as, quote, Flint's song hit of the week throughout the 1937 sit-down wave. The Times reporter noted that a sound truck led workers both inside the factory and the picket lines on the outside in mass singing, and he proclaimed that, quote, thousands of voices roar the words. The crowd particularly relishes the whip-like effect of the soup, excitement high, end quote. The Detroit Free Press reported that the Emergency Women's Brigade planned to bring in an orchestra to play outside the factory while picketers danced to the tunes on the inside. Other songs like Sit Down and We Are the Guys were widely sung throughout Detroit during the Great Union Drives. Sugar wrote Sit Down during the avalanche of sit-down strikes which occurred in the early months of 1937. Everybody remembers the 1937 GM sit-down strike, but what's lost on a lot of people are the sit-down strikes in places like Woolworth's Five and Dime. I mean, when I say Woolworth, we typically think of the South, right? Well, a long time before anybody had heard about the sit-ins, there was the sit-down strike at Woolworths in places like Detroit, and Maurice Sugar is going to make his presence felt here as well. I could talk all day about sit-down strikes as a labor historian, but I think that you'd much prefer these guys take over for me.
So with sit-down strikes, not only did they change the face of Michigan and Detroit, where I'm from, in Flint, Michigan, a city that still doesn't have clean water, years later, there was a huge sit-down strike that lasted from New Year's Eve, 1936, to late February 1937, and led to General Motors being unionized. And this was 4 years before Henry Ford finally had to give in as well. I should have told you, this is Maurice Sugar here, that we have only a few pictures of him, but when Occupy happened, I was involved just getting out of law school. And I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of the Occupy movement or were around or studied the Occupy movement. But in many ways, it blew me away because that word occupy, just the idea of taking over and sitting down and just saying, we are going to occupy this space as space of ours, as a space that we have an interest in, was really powerful. And I do think this is probably Maurice Sugar's most famous song. It was actually, the previous song I sung, Soup, was actually My Bonnie Lies Over the Ocean, which is a very common thing that songwriters and folk singers and blues people did to kind of make it as popular culture, as resonating in popular culture as the other songs were. The sit-down song, I think, might be the only song Maurice Sugar actually might have written original music to, or at least tried to. He might have had some help, but okay, we're going to give it a shot. And just like the last four verses.
Yeah.
When they tie their can to the Union man, sit down, sit down. When they give him the sack, they'll take him back, sit down, sit down. Sit down and take a seat, sit down and rest your feet. Sit down, you got 'em beat. Sit down, sit down, sit down, sit down. When they smile and say no raising pay, sit down, sit down. When you want the boss to come across, sit down.
Once again, Sugar claimed that this song was sung regularly at strikes throughout Detroit and the surrounding regions throughout the late 1930s. We Are the Guys was similar in the sense that it emphasized the notion of the worker as the forgotten man, and I simply can't do this justice. Tony will tell you why why We Are the Guys are so important in just a second, and the good work that he himself did to really rescue this for history so that we can stand here and present it here for you today. So I'll turn it over to the musicians again.
Okay, now this one is near and dear to my heart because I went through Maurice Sugar's papers. He has all his papers at the Walter Reuther Library, right, in Detroit, Michigan. And if you're ever interested in labor history, there's a conference at Wayne State University every year in October that pretty much is in the backyard of Sugar Law Center and as well the library. So when I'm going through his papers, and they all, his documents all smell like pipe smoke. He was a big pipe smoker. And I was fascinated at things that he would write down that seemed to be lost. He had a poem that was written in 1936, and I actually have, for anybody who wants it, copies of his actual original typewritten lyrics here. And when I saw them as a labor attorney, I was at once amazed that he was onto such unique themes. And, you know, as we all know, as your generation especially knows, certain types of jobs out there that you're going to be working, sometimes that you have to work in, you know, when you're young, they prevent you from participating in the same type of economy that you're supporting. You know, you're serving food, but it would cost you a lot of money to eat there. You're doing retail, but you can't afford some of those clothes. And I couldn't believe that he was, 1936, was already onto the fact that that was happening to workers. And I loved that part as much as I thought some of the other stuff was very cheesy, right? Some of it's just the times, but in 1936, you know, women were a very instrumental part of the movement. Sit-down strikes at Woolworths and all around Detroit were women-led. And the Hunger March was one of the earliest mixed race, mixed gender types of marches that were around. But with We Are the Guys, I thought that it was a little outdated. So we changed it to We Are the Ones. And because there was no music I've ever seen to this that I could find, I put some music to it, okay? So I have both his original versions and what I did to it, if anybody wants to see it. I just played this song at a music festival in Hamtramck, Michigan with violins and full-blown rock and roll band because I believe that the rhythm is there and the spirit is there and we just have to put new skin on old bones, right? Okay.
What you got? My stomach suck away against the
For very obvious reasons, that's my favorite, and I always enjoy when Tony plays it with the banjo. I mean, my goodness, that's just the icing on the cake, right? So, A big part of this paper, the point of the paper, is to demonstrate the lasting legacy of Maurice Sugar's work when it comes to the cultural front. And in time, as Dr. Sanchez is going to share with us here in a minute, Sugar's work is going to be picked up not only in Detroit but elsewhere and intertwined with various social movements. One of the things that I was thinking of when I put this paper together was the lasting legacy of mass singing in social movements. And one of the first things that came to my mind was a PBS documentary, an oldie but a goodie. I bet many of you are familiar with it. Eyes on the Prize. It was done many years ago. And one of my favorite episodes, it was a PBS series, and one of my favorite episodes was Ain't Scared of Your Jails. In 1960, what was happening in places like Nashville and Greensboro, North Carolina, was a sit-in movement where students your age would sit down at the lunch counter. African-American students would refuse to leave. They'd order lunch, refuse to leave until they were served lunch. Now, the old rule of thumb was white and black did not eat together, and they just became determined to integrate the lunch counters. Now, what will end up happening is these individuals are social activists, very similar to Maurice Sugar, and they're going to be arrested. Being arrested in the rural South was not the thing to do. It brings shame not only to you, yourself, but your family as well. So people avoided it like the plague. So have these individuals hauled off to the county jail was a very, very dramatic thing. And obviously the jails were segregated. There'd be a men's section and a ladies section of the jail, but it was mass singing that kind of kept the spirits high in this very dark moment, very, very tense moment, right? The ladies sing to the men, and because they were so close in proximity, the men sing back to them. And again, this demonstrates how effective music is, mass singing is to the general movement. But in 1945, things are going to change a little bit. By 1945, Sugar's career is going to, I wouldn't say fade, but it's certainly going to change. And it's that same year that a New Yorker is going to take up residence in Detroit with an absolute fascination with unions, as well as the democracy, the small d democracy that they could bring. Yeah. Maurice Sugar, when did he die?
He died in 1974.
74.
He was
There's a reason
53.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a reason I ended up teaching history. So. Anyway. Elizabeth Hawes was fascinated with unions as well as the democratic spirit that they offered. She was also a fashion designer and a left-leaning journalist who wrote for mainstream periodicals, including PM magazine. In 1944, she accepted a job through the UAW Education Department, where she was given the specific job of reaching out to women, not only women workers, but the wives of the workers as well. That same year, the Detroit Free Press hired her to write a weekly column. Now, you don't think of the Free Press the way that it was thought of back in the 30s and 40s. It was really a well-respected paper, right up there with the Washington Post. More importantly, writing a column for a paper of that magnitude was a really big deal. There's another woman that had a nationally syndicated column that would appear every Sunday by the name of Eleanor Roosevelt. It was called My Day, and she tackled issues that were controversial, and to some instances, they were taboo. Much like Maurice Sugar, Hawes was the quintessential labor union intellectual, and in fact, many aspects of what she envisioned a post-World War II nation to look like meshed very well with some of these leftists, including but not limited to Maurice Sugar. She touched on a litany of various topics through her columns. But generally, it comes down to three things. One, social equality of the sexes. Women should be paid as much as men and should be treated like men. Two, anti-fascism and the empowerment of the disempowered. Three, the campaign for economic equality and full employment in a post-war world. Equal opportunity for women was probably the closest to Hawes's heart. She once proclaimed that, quote, one of the reasons why women are backwards politically is men, end quote. Driving at the concept of social expectations that simply assume ladies would be responsible for things like shopping, childcare, housework. These rigid gender roles had stifled women's development politically as well as beyond. And to that end, the 30-hour work week would open up employment opportunities for both sexes and make it, quote, possible for every adult to fully participate in this democracy of ours. Through having to devote only 30 hours a week to earning money, we could make sure that what comes in our pay envelopes buys us all the things we need for a good life, end quote. She went on to point out, with children in school 30 hours, as they normally are, and with both parents working only 30 hours, it would be quite possible to make the home fires burn more brightly than ever and still have time to go to the movies and take a ride in the new car we're all supposed to get after the war. Detroiters read Hawes' columns with a voracious appetite. As a matter of fact, the Free Press actually ended up having to hire more people just to handle the volumes of correspondence that she received. Some readers applauded her visions, while others condemned them unilaterally. One of my favorites was a guy that wrote in and blasted her commentary in the 30-hour week, proclaiming that men should be treated as men and not as housewives. And her response, I think, is terribly, terribly inappropriate. To that end, she pointed out that most people are, quote, feministic enough to think that women of America can and should do other things as well, things political, economic, social, and patriotic, end quote. Despite the pushback, Hawes continued to push this agenda throughout the war years, and her vision of equality of the sexes would resemble those feminists of the 1960s and 70s, many of whom ran around in radical circles on their own right. By 1945, it might be said that Hawes was replacing Maurice Sugar as the labor union intellectual. She wrote a weekly column published by one of the most respected newspapers in the country, which reached thousands of workers both in Detroit and beyond. She also had a foot firmly established in the labor movement, the officialdom of organized labor. Similar to Sugar, her position within the movement, combined with her use of mass culture, allowed Hawes to communicate important messaging within Detroit's working class. Unfortunately, both Sugar and Hawes were casualties of what historians call the Second Red Scare. Late 1945, for reasons that have never really been clear to me, she left Detroit and she returned to her native New York, where she resumed a career in the fashion industry. In 1946, she wrote a book that was entitled Hurry Up, Please, It's Time. And just, on a personal note, this is really what was so inspirational and so important in terms of my own scholarship. But the book is going to celebrate the democratic spirit of unionism, and like Sugar, it advocated the use of innovative methods when it came to mobilizing workers for the improvement standard of American life. The labor union intellectual, I think, is something that the movement lost. This Cold War consensus that I was talking about just a minute ago was a central factor in pushing out both Sugar as well as Hawes from the ranks of organized labor. Their fates were hardly confined to Detroit or the UAW. The more important consequence, though, was that the labor movement lost this can-do people, those can-do people who were willing to slog with the union and bring inventive, enthusiastic energy to it to convey very critical issues, including but not limited to messaging. The labor movement might have lost this, but as I insinuated just a few minutes ago, other social movements are going to pick this up, take the ball and run with it. And to that end, I think Dr. Sanchez's work, especially when it intersects with the Chicano movement, would be quite appropriate as far as how Maurice Sugar's work is emulated and carried on today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sanchez.
Unfortunately, I'll be reading and I won't be able to play fun music, but I think as Dr. Pettengill and Tony Paris have explained so well, music's incredibly important in introducing people to labor movement culture and ideas for all kinds of reasons. It's much more interesting than lectures. And so that last song, We're the Ones, right? We're free to make you money all the time. You get it, right? As opposed to me being up here talking for like 20 minutes about the surplus value of labor, right? You're already like, whatever, right? And you're like, let the guy play guitar. And so that's important. And the left was really important with all its flaws. It does have flaws, but it was really important in putting forward these ideas that many of us accept as kind of mainstream, but they were incredibly radical at the time, and they were able to do it through culture. And so that's important. Music was important because it's portable, right? It crosses boundaries, it crosses borders, it crosses languages, and it also crosses culture. And so one of the songs, I have two examples. One of the songs that's really important through the 19th and 20th century is a song called "We Shall Not Be Moved." And so its origins come in the 19th century. It's kind of a spiritual, it's a revival song. And so imagine, I don't know if any of you guys have gone to tent revivals, right? But these tent revivals where they catch the spirit, right? And they're singing, and it's kind of this religious song in the South. But by the late 19th century, when you guys start learning, if you're in History 1302 already, the Second Industrial Revolution, we start seeing labor conditions change and they become dangerous and exploitative and poorly paid. And so in the South, in Appalachia, you have quite a bit of coal mining. And so coal miners, both black and white, start to fight these working conditions. Remember, every 1 in 26 workers in the United States are getting injured on the job. 1 in every 399 are getting killed on the job, right? My students are going like, yeah, you tell us this like every single day. Right, and so they start singing "We Shall Not Be Moved," this song, when they're protesting, and it's powerful, right? Like the mine owners have the ability, just like Ford did, putting machine guns on his factory, they have the ability to hurt them, right? That the government and the kind of state apparatus and the police are on their side, and so they have real reason to fear. And so being able to sing this song, saying, "You will not move us, we shall not be moved, we will stand here, we will sit here, we'll strike here for dignity, and we shall not be moved," man, that pumps you up, right? And so it starts to become this protest song by the late 19th century, and the left, the kind of populist front, that left culture goes across the country, right? In Texas, as much as we have this kind of red state we have this kind of idea that it's incredibly conservative. For much of the 19th and early 20th century, Texas was kind of radical. The Populists were around. By the 20s and 30s, the Socialist Party was the second largest party in Texas. And so there was that left culture. And because Texas had the largest collection of ethnic Mexicans, had the largest population of ethnic Mexicans until the 1950s, when California surpasses us, so we're number 2 still, right? Ethnic Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and Mexican nationals played a central role in that labor movement because they were being brought in either as kind of ways to get around unions, scab labor, or brought in to work in incredibly difficult jobs as well for low pay. And so in the 1930s, they take that song, "We Shall Not Be Moved," and it's translated. And so in the 1930s, many folks believe it gets translated in San Antonio or in other places, right? That's a difficult thing about popular culture, is we can't pin it down. But in the 1930s, San Antonio is central to the pecan shelling industry. Any of you guys eat pecans? It used to be done by hand, right? And the pecan shelling industry was huge in Texas because Texas has a lot of pecans, and most of that was shelled because it comes in those little shells and you got to break them in Texas. And it was mainly ethnic Mexicans doing that labor, and quite a bit of women and quite a lot of children. And so they kept cutting wages in the 1930s, and so finally workers got tired of it and they went on strike. And there were a couple of unions involved, but some of them just thought Mexicans were kind of in the ideas of the time. They thought they were kind of lethargic or lazy, and so many didn't want to get involved. Well, the Socialist Party was like, yeah, we'll organize them. A couple more of the radical kind of labor unions said, we'll try it. And so Emma Tenayuca is a labor organizer at the time. She's part of the Communist Party in Texas. She goes and helps organize hundreds of these workers in Texas, and the police round them up when they go on strike for better working conditions, better pay, less hours, and they throw them in prison. And so in these prisons, again, they could beat you, you could be disappeared, and so they're a bit scared. And so in one of these cells in San Antonio, supposedly this jail cell was made for 6 people, but was holding 20 plus people in it. And these were true across this jail cell. They're worried, and they start translating some of these labor songs on the spot, right? Because Mexican Americans and ethnic Mexicans are bilingual. And so they start singing one person who knows some of these songs starts saying them, and they translate them on the spots. And one of the songs that they start translating is "We Shall Not Be Moved" to "No Nos Moverán," right, in Spanish. And so that takes off like wildfire. And so as Dr. Pettengill explained, right, one of the central tenets of the labor movement was kind of anti-fascism. And so Americans in the 1930s, Americans were opposed to fascism as well. And there was a group of Americans who also left to fight fascism in Spain. There was a civil war going on in Spain among kind of fascists and Spanish Republicans. And so it was called the Lincoln Brigades. And they went over. And so some historians believe that's how No Nos Moverán gets to Spain in the 1930s, that American leftists fighting fascism go to Spain, and they kind of spread this song in Spain, but it keeps growing in its importance. By the time you get to the civil rights movement, it becomes a powerful civil rights anthem in English and in Spanish, and then it goes global. What we see is in the 1970s, it continues to be used as a song against Franco's dictatorship, General Francisco Franco, who's a fascist. And then in Chile, in 1973, what we get is a democratically elected socialist president, Salvador Allende, right? It's a fair and free election, and they vote him in. Well, we're worried about communism at this time, and so the CIA backs a military coup. And so as bombs are falling, these are CIA airplanes, right? American airplanes dropping bombs on the presidential palace in Santiago, Chile, right? As this coup's taking place, one of the last remaining radio stations in the country that's on the side of Allende's plays as their last transmission, No nos moverán, right? We shall not be moved. And so here's this kind of interesting moment in which we have kind of the forces of the right in the United States meeting the forces of the left, but gone global, right? And so that's one example of kind of the importance of this movement culture in music. And the other is the movement culture in other kinds of songs in the Chicano movement, right? And so the civil rights movement isn't just African Americans, right? It's this movement of all groups of people in the United States pushing forward dignity, equality, justice, and civil rights. And so what we see is in the Chicano movement, they take a Mexican music tradition called the corrido, right? And this is kind of a ballad. It's a story. You begin with something, you tell the story over time. Well, they take that tradition because many of their parents were Mexican immigrants, right? And they had grown up listening to them, and they transform it, and they tell their stories in the United States through the corrido. And it's really important, and again, introducing folks to some of the central themes of what they're pushing for, some of the central villains that they're fighting against, right? And what's happening to them. And so there's a few songs. There's a movement band called Conjunto Aztlán. And so they were founded by a couple of folks from San Antonio and some folks from Texas. They were students at the University of Texas at Austin. And so they sang a song called Yo soy tu hermano, yo soy Chicano, right? I'm your brother, I'm Chicano, but it rhymes in Spanish. And so one of the verses, they identify the villains, and so they say, ya estoy cansado de voltear la cara, ya mi paciencia ya se me acabó, chotas y rinches son muy desgraciados y la ley gringa se burla de mí, right? So the translation is, I'm tired of turning my cheek, right? My patience is done. It's over. Chotas and rinches, that's the police and the rangers, right? But kind of mean words about them, right? Kind of calling them like pigs and whatever, right? They don't have any desgraciados. They don't have any shame, right? Which is like a horrible thing if you're Latino, right? To be without shame, and sort of the gringo law is making fun of me. And so they go on and they say, I'm your brother, I'm Chicano, give me your hand, we're going to fly. Of course, this all rhymes. Like the dicho says, if my brother's bleeding, I am also bleeding. The wound is the same. They take our lands, they steal our work, they killed my brother over there in Vietnam, right? I'm asking La Virgen de Guadalupe for forgiveness. There's so much injustice. This has forced me to fight, right? And so they've introduced you some of the villains, the characters, and so they're saying this Chicano movement is a larger struggle against discrimination, against racism, but also colonialism. And so they took, in this case, right, again, if we're thinking about how music is important in introducing some of these and how it's able to jump languages and borders and cultures, in this case, young Chicana and Chicano activists were able to take a Mexican musical tradition and turn it into a key part of the American Civil Rights Movement. And again, showing how music can go back and forth across borders. And the Chicano movement had
a culture, kind of a movement all of its own as well. That I can, if anyone's interested, I can talk to you about afterwards. But they had plays and they had poems as well. But music is so much easier to sing and much more interesting. And so music does play a central role in introducing people to movement, culture, and ideas.
Thank you, Dr. Sanchez, for that connection. I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't take you out to, I mean, you mentioned Woody Guthrie and maybe his most famous song, a song that you all know in some form or fashion, This Land Is Your Land. I thought that maybe we could close with that.
And this is one of my favorite songs, so you have to remember that these things were so, I love them so much because there's secrets in each song. If they went straight up and wrote a song saying, let's kill the cops, right? We all saw what happened when NWA did that, right? They got in a lot of trouble. So the beauty of the blues and the beauty of folk music is that there's subtle ways to do it. Or if you start singing it to little kids, they don't really know. But the blues, while popular white culture was singing about how much is that doggy in the window, blues and folk music and Latino music is talking about these things, but just undercover. There's codes, right? There's codes for the Underground Railroad, there's codes for all this type of stuff. And so I didn't realize singing this song, that This Land Is Your Land, that you all probably sung, until I was singing this to a very old labor person who passed away in December, who knew Maurice Sugar, named Dean Robb, at 95 years old. And he told me, one of his last things he told me was that he wanted me to sing the communist verse. And I was like, what verse is that? And it's towards the end, and you'll see it, but it talks specifically about property and trespassing and a sign. And as little kids, we didn't really know that this was the way that we communicate through culture. And through all the other things that would happen when the law is slow, or I remember this great interview with Obama when they were like, so what happened? Like, what do you regret? What do you think you could have done better? He was like, well, I spent time trying to figure out how many votes I would need to get across the aisle and figuring out what laws would need to change and how long that would take and what justices in the Supreme Court could do what. I didn't realize that so much of our change that needs to happen, or that we believe needs to happen, comes from that culture, from what's cool, from what we talk about, from the music we listen to the movies we watch. And so that is an important thing that Maurice Sugar, and why I just love Ryan's paper, and why thank God for John on the banjo, because this was a way for non-amplified instruments, before the electric guitar, for us to all sing around together and share these types of ideas. And that culture and that change is really what you all, as young people, are going to be the leaders of. The last, I have a letter of Maurice Sugar's. The last thing that I ever found that he wrote was a old Mahalia Jackson, who was a famous gospel Christian singer, an amazing gospel singer, African-American woman, who had a song called I Found the Answer. And it was, I found the answer, and she talks about praying. Well, Maurice Sugar had heard this and loved it, but he didn't want it to be only about prayer. He wanted I Found the Answer to be, and he wanted it to be non-denominational or non-religious. And so he tried to redo it, and the last thing that he wrote to a group of friends of his that were down organizing in the South in the 60s, when he was already approaching his end, was, will you take this to the young people? Will you take my version of it? It's more simple. You don't need the church to do it. Can you take it to the young people, and please just leave it at colleges and things, and maybe they will help change the culture. And it doesn't matter your age. I've seen young people who are super old, and I've seen old people who are super young. But it's that passion that we're going to leave you all with, okay? And you're going to sing this to your children and your nieces and nephews. So this land is your land, this land is my land.
I want to thank everybody for coming out. I especially want to thank Tony for coming all the way down from Detroit. And I really, really appreciate Jonathan York. And among all the other things that Jonathan is an expert in, the banjo. Thank you so much. I very, very much appreciate that. I'll close with saying, I hope this gives you a little bit new perspective in terms of music. It certainly did for me. I certainly learned a lot from what Dr. Sanchez had to say. So, with that, I bid you good afternoon. But I would be glad to take your questions. We would be glad to take your questions. Of course, if you've got to be in class or if you're unlucky enough to be on a search committee.
That would be me.
I also understand. So, yeah. Thank you for your attention.